Anyways, neither here nor there. Y'all are here to talk about electrification, and we're really excited to have you. You might have noticed this already, but in case you actually came to this space through Sierra Club, there's a good chance that you actually came in through Ruth Sawyer's personal Zoom link. And so if you happen to see a bunch of Ruth Sawyers pop up, don't be alarmed. There's only one Ruth Sawyer. And if that happens to be you, you can go ahead and rename yourself. So hi, good to see all of y'all and some familiar faces. I wanted to just start off by letting y'all know that this is actually an experimental thing for us. We are a collaboration. We're a cohort of different folks from different organizations. I am Michelle Pignon. I will introduce myself more thoroughly, and y'all will get to know me a little bit better if you don't already. I'm currently with the Safe Cities campaign at Stand.earth. This webinar is also co-hosted by our friends at Sierra Club Washington State, as well as our friends at 350 Seattle, as well as our friends at Unite Here. So we're really excited to have a diverse set of speakers who are really capturing the full complexity of this webinar. So apologies to anybody who missed the K-pop, but I promise I can send you links afterwards as well. So let's go ahead and get started and just kind of run through the agenda for today. We wanted to first start off by talking a little bit about the national significance of the Electrify Seattle campaign and why it's so important. Then we want to move into this conversation about why electrification, why now, and what it actually is. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of electrification. Who are the key players? Where are the sticky points? Who are folks that we need to move along the journey? You will also have something very unique that is not very common in environmental spaces, where we're actually going to hear voices from labor who've had some unlikely alliances that have been proven to be really powerful on the ground in Seattle. And then once you're all like properly riled up, we're going to actually talk to you about how you can support this campaign, both if you are in Seattle and if you're outside of Seattle, because we have both folks in the area as well as out-of-towners who have ways to take action, including directing some calls to the mayor's office, as well as showing up in person for some Earth Day happenings. And then lastly, we will have some Q&A opportunities for folks that have questions, particularly about how this campaign can apply to their work. So hold your questions, well, don't hold them, put them in the chat and we'll keep track of them and answer them towards the end of the conversation. But yeah, that's the agenda for today. But let's get started right into it. I wanted to open this space for those of you that have had the have had an opportunity to work with me before. You know that I always like to spend a little bit of time grounding us in sort of the human parts of these campaigns. So who is in this photo? You got baby Michelle over here, as well as my sister, as well as my first little dog. But also I had to highlight them because they're barely even visible. This is my mom, and this is my little dog, Juan Pablo. And I wanted to show this photo because I wanted to talk a little bit about how buildings fundamentally shape our lives. They shape our habits, they shape our routines, they shape our health and our outlook on life. I wanted in particular share what has been a reoccurring theme every time I go visit my mom. I currently live in LA, which is where I'm originally from. I live about a 20-minute drive away from my mom's house. And what has been a very interesting thing since I started working in this particular role is my mom has actually been going through an energy retrofit of her house.
All right.
She is moving through it actually through like a publicly funded process. So they have an agency that goes around door to door and they do the different retrofits, but they're doing it really, really, really slowly. And so something that has been really challenging to me and really kind of gets at this question about how buildings shape us is that for most of my childhood, I was just like my mom. You're cold, put on more blankets, put on more sweaters. It's not uncommon during the winter, even though we're in Los Angeles, for each of us to be wearing at minimum three sweaters. And during the summer, we're all like hatchy over here, where you're just dying of heat. In particular, most places in Southern California, but not all places, have air conditioning. I actually grew up not having any air conditioning at all. So some of my most vivid memories of kind of tolerating the summer are very much getting a bunch of popsicles, figuring out when to go on car rides with my friends, going to the mall and just enjoying the AC that I could experience there. And for a long time, that worked just well enough for us. We also had to mitigate the reality that in Southern California, we're very prone to blackouts during the summer months because the energy grid is just completely overwhelmed. However, even though my mom is slowly going through this whole energy retrofit process, I feel a lot of angst knowing that as she's getting older and, you know, she's not as easily able to tolerate the different changes in temperature, this is something that she has to navigate. And it has been really infuriating that even though it is a public good that is being provided, it takes months between appointments for them to come by. They'll come by and be like, oh yeah, you need insulation. See you in 6 months when we're able to actually come through, or you need a new door, but we'll see you in 9 months when we're able to actually make an appointment. So all this to me speaks a lot about how the places that we live in give us very much affect our lives. And particularly as we become older or more vulnerable because of health issues that we might have, it becomes all the more important to really tackle these issues proactively. Now, being a little Los Angeles kid, I have perpetually in my professional career been looking for something different. I actually lived in Seattle for a good 7 years after I graduated. And a big reason why I did that was because I got sick as a kid. I had asthma. It was caused by many things, probably the gas stove, in addition to the many pollutants in the vicinity. And I also became really cognizant of how LA is not known to be a generous city. We have a long history of very blatant, very obvious social stratification, as many cities do. But our politicians, they don't really lean into the environmental piece of it. So I found myself perpetually asking, like, where can I go that I can both be healthy in my own body, but also learn strategies to bring it back to Los Angeles? And through the pandemic, I actually ended up coming back to Los Angeles, and I'm currently in this role through the Safe Cities Network at Stand, which is really all about figuring out how it's not just a few individual fights that are fighting independently uphill, but how we're actually sharing the learnings that we're having across different geographies. Because Los Angeles, as much as I would love them to, are not going to lead on some of these things. Like, we need some examples, particularly when it comes to existing buildings. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is that it's tricky finding a path forward. The cities that we have, they reflect a really long history of environmental inequities. And we have to continuously be asking ourselves, how is the climate activism that we're doing actually fundamentally reshaping those power dynamics? And I think about this in the context for my mom as she's waiting for these energy retrofits. It's great that it exists. However, like, can we really expect a woman in her 67, not access to a car, limited English, to be able to navigate that maze? It's been difficult even for me as somebody who's in sort of the know of how to navigate these systems. So we have to be asking ourselves these really hard questions as we are developing and crafting. And part of the reason I feel very, very strongly about hosting this webinar with not just Seattle folks, but also folks from outside of Seattle, is to share some of those learnings. And I came to this work at SAFE particularly because it's a network. It's meant to kind of help engage and be creative and find new solutions. It is particularly evident in this conversation about how we're going to move and deal with our existing buildings that we need to think about these difficult equity questions. And I'm really excited to know personally some of the folks on the ground that are leading on this work in Seattle. And so without further ado, I will cede the floor to the folks in Seattle to actually tell us what's going on. How did y'all devise this program, and how can we be supportive? So I believe the force in speaking order is Brian. And Brian, I would ask if you could introduce who you are and what brings you to this work first.
Yeah, thanks for that great introduction, Michelle. I don't have pictures of myself as a kid or a long backstory, but I will say my name is Brian and I go by he, him pronouns. And I've lived in the Seattle area for a decade and been a part of the Sierra Club chapter here for the last 7 years. And I'm gonna basically give just a high-level overview of electrification to start us off before we kind of go into the details. And I really wanted to address a few questions. So first of all, just what is electrification in general? And then more specifically, what is electrification with respect to buildings? And why would we go for large buildings first for electrification, and why the building performance standards specifically? So electrification is the process of transitioning appliances and machines from gas and oil power to electric power. So this means anything from space heating, which is one of the larger contributors of emissions, to water heating, cooking, and other appliances. Of all of the different climate actions we can take right now, electrification is definitely one of the most impactful. It's a low-hanging fruit that we can go after right now. So in general, powering machines with electricity is more efficient than gas or oil. Even electric appliances that use electricity from fossil fuel sources are much more efficient than piping fossil fuels to individual buildings and burning it there on site. And this is just because, it's more efficient to have like a large fossil fuel burn rather than in the individual homes. But if we go after electrification now, we get that efficiency. Plus, as we get our grid more and more onto renewable energy sources, we have even more emission reduction going forward into the future. And fortunately, Washington is already pretty good about renewable energy sources. So, an individual and large example of electrification is using heat pumps instead of natural gas furnaces. And heat pumps are significantly more efficient. They're actually over 100% efficient just because of how they operate and the engineering behind them. Whereas something like a natural gas furnace is much lower, 50 or less percent efficient. And this technology is improving more and more every single year. So besides just the efficiency and the climate aspect, burning fossil fuels on site is really bad for the air. So there's lots of pollution locally in areas with a lot of gas. And those dangerous fumes are released both inside houses for like stoves and ranges, and also into the local environment. And according to a Harvard study, fossil fuel use in buildings is responsible for thousands of early deaths and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of annual health impacts. Basically, an estimated 53 premature deaths in Washington have been estimated by Harvard in 2017. Children's asthma rates are kind of one of the main things too in terms of health risks. So these health risks are also mainly disproportionately felt by communities of color and people with lower incomes. So electrification is a great next step to take to reduce climate change, to help out some of these communities, and help out health in general. So why large buildings? Well, basically, Seattle's buildings are responsible for more than a third of carbon emissions, and burning oil and gas in commercial and multifamily buildings, like larger buildings, accounts for 90% of the building-related greenhouse gas emissions. So a huge part of the pie is buildings, and then most of that pie for buildings is the larger buildings. So this is something that we can go after first to help with climate change. And the time to do this is now for a few different reasons. One is we got to take action for climate change, but also we have some initiatives already started that we need to meet somehow. One of them is the 2018 Climate Action Strategy, which calls for an almost 40% reduction in the building sector by 2030 in Seattle and a net zero carbon emission by 2050. And then the City Council of Seattle has a Green New Deal resolution that's a little bit more aggressive, even calling for Seattle to be free of climate pollutants sooner than by 2030. So this is where the buildings performance standard policy comes from. And I'll pass it on to Ruth to explain a little bit more with that.
Yes, hello everyone. This is the real Ruth Sawyer. Yeah, many of you may have noticed you were accidentally named Ruth Sawyer upon entering. I think there's one imposter Ruth left. So, if you are inclined to reveal your identity, we'd love if you'd rename yourself. Yeah, okay, so what about this building performance standard policy and what we think we need to do to, yeah. So basically, when this policy was first conceived by our former mayor, and she asked the Office of Sustainability and Environment to come up with a policy that would help large. They came up with a policy And they started talking to us about it late last year. We thought it was going to be a slam dunk and that we'd have it passed by March, because they had the policy developed. It seemed like all the ducks were in a row. All the city council members who supported it, that it would just pass through. But it turns out that it hasn't been that simple. So the Office of Sustainability and Environment has been meeting with stakeholders who are building owners and been getting a lot of pushback politically from these large, powerful, wealthy building owners in our city. And so we're now in a position where the policy has been pushed back. We're definitely not passing it by March, obviously, and it's probably going to be voted on later this year. But we're also in a position of having to take the policy out of the back rooms and into the public eye. Right now, the power of the building owners is pretty massive compared to our power in those back rooms. They can make a lot of promises and threats in those back rooms that we can't really. Environmental organizations who are tracking this, and our power comes from our people, right? So we're
Oh,
you're going in and out, Ruth. You're Ruth.
yeah. Ruth, I think your internet
We
is a little
lost you.
choppy.
Oh shoot! Well, thanks for the heads up.
It was a little choppy for a while, but it was like manageable choppy, but then it got real choppy.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. How is it now?
It's not great.
Oh, I could pass to Neil if you're up for a Hail Mary, Neil, to deliver some of the same content.
Yeah, that's fine. Although if you go off video, it may clear that up.
Oh.
You want to try that first?
Yeah, test. I am talking and it is clear, or is it not clear?
Yeah, it's actually a lot better.
Oh, Neil with the Hail Mary. Okay, well, Michelle, I can see your video, so just like move your arms if
Okay.
if it's not clear, or chat, because if my internet's bad, I may not see you. I guess that'll be an indication too if you're frozen. And so actually, tell me, would it be helpful if I go through?
Oh no.
That
Oh
again,
no, got garbled a little again.
or
Ooh. Sign up
maybe
with
just
Ed. Neil, do you want to try taking over for a little bit? Maybe Ruth can call in.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. Yeah, Ruth, if you want to try to just use phone audio. But okay, so as Ruth was saying, and I think people were able to hear most of that, but so it was started by the mayor's office. It was something that we thought might go through, just given the makeup of the council. What has happened is that building owners have been talking to the mayor and saying, we'd rather not do this. This is going to cost money. We'd rather not. We'd rather not retrofit. So the mayor is listening to that for a couple of reasons. One, just because they're the only ones in the room right now. That's all he's hearing from. But the other reason is within Seattle, downtown was hit pretty hard by the pandemic. And one of Mayor Harrell's biggest priorities is to revitalize downtown. And so building owners are saying, hey, you're asking us to help with that by asking our employees to come back, asking us to reopen shops. And so he feels somewhat beholden to them. So the politics are such that they have kind of an outside voice based on some other things that he had wanted to do during his term. So What that means is that we need counter pressure. We need for environmental organizations, for one, but also the general public to say, wait a second, this is something that's really important. Until now, it had sort of flown under the radar because everyone thought that this should pass. But now that we think that it is in danger, really important that we start to build up some pressure to say, yeah, I know you're hearing from some people that don't want it, but there are a lot more people who do. And so what has happened right now is, in terms of the way it's been weakened, the timelines have been extended somewhat. The compliance fees have been reduced to the point where it may actually just be cheaper for building owners to pay fines than to retrofit, which means this policy wouldn't accomplish anything. And so what we're pushing for is not just pass this policy, but make it a policy that's going to bring about real change. So more aggressive timelines, even than the original policy, since they were woefully inadequate. And also compliance fees that will actually drive retrofits to happen. And so, yeah, I don't know if Ruth is back and wants to take back over.
Oh man, the like amount of Ruth, but no, not the real Ruth. The real Ruth make it back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wow. I heard all of that, Neil, loud and clear. That was great. I guess the only thing I'll add by way of passing it on to our next speaker is that one thing that I think is really cool about some of the work that's happened in Seattle, and particularly led by 350 Seattle, is a lot of work to align with labor and workers. And yeah, there's been some campaigns in the past specifically targeting, like, what are some things that we can all agree on? What are some things that are going to benefit all of our constituencies? And so, yeah, with this particular policy, our local labor council has endorsed it. And we're also working with hotel workers to endorse and support a similar policy, making cleaner, greener buildings, cleaner, greener hotels. So here to talk about that and some of our work together is Stefan. So take it away, Stefan.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be here in this space. I'm Stefan Moritz. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm with the Hotel Workers Union in Seattle, Unite Here Local 8. And I think, you know, us internally and in the labor movement have been thinking for a long time about how can we engage with environmental work and climate organizing. Because we recognize, and us as a union that represents low-wage workers, right? Like a lot of our members are immigrants, a lot of our members are people of color, a lot of our members live in the communities that are the most affected by climate change and the negative effects of it. You know, really realizing that our fights are interconnected, and workers who can't afford to live close to where they work have to spend hours and hours in their cars commuting to and from work every day. They can't afford childcare. They can't, you know, live their fullest and best lives, and they suffer the consequences of pollution and others, you know, effects of climate change. And so, you know, and we also, and especially coming out of the pandemic, right? We have learned and realized, like, just how much our industry has taken advantage of people, and how this industry is also taking advantage of the planet and the environment. And so we feel like those things are so closely connected, and we need to do something about it. And so we've started talking to 350 and the Sierra Club and others in the community about how we can do something together. I think maybe what I want to say about the industry as well is, you know, obviously the tourism industry as a whole, right? Air travel, cruise ships, you know, is a major source of emissions, but the hotels also actually are, when it comes to buildings, right? And the big buildings that Neil and Brian were talking about, right? Hotels actually have higher carbon emissions than office, apartment, or school buildings, right? And we think that, you know, given all of this and given the conversations about buildings that is happening around existing buildings, there's an opportunity to actually do more and also focus on what the future holds and how we make sure that new hotels and the future of tourism we build is sustainable. So, and one thing I want to address about the industry as well is hotels have been very good about sort of greenwashing their programs and, trying to sell to people that they're actually great on the environment, right? There's this program at Marriott, right, that's called Make a Green Choice, which is basically you tell the hotel not to clean your room, and in return you get a cup of coffee or some points, on your Marriott rewards program. What that does, though, is it takes away hours and regular work from hotel workers, from the housekeepers who clean those rooms. So folks are struggling to make full-time jobs, qualify for the healthcare, all of those things. But for those workers who still work, they then have to clean rooms where people, oftentimes with families, have lived in for 3, 4, 5 days, right? People take a lot of takeout up to their room now. And so the rooms are trashed and those rooms are harder to clean. There's more injuries. And so workers suffer all along. They lose income on one side. Their bodies are strained more than ever before. And so this has to stop. And we feel we have to hold the industry accountable. And so that's what brings us to our idea. And I think it's a big opportunity for Seattle to distinguish itself from other communities, right? A lot of travelers say we want sustainable choices, right? We want travel options that prioritize the environment. And so, that's why we think that city leaders should actually, listen to us and be really excited about this. So we are, and we're gonna announce publicly on Earth Day, right? Which we're gonna get to in a minute here, that we will be introducing a policy to actually hold hotels to a much higher standard when it comes to how they're being built, right? Like how hotels are being developed and built. And the way this program is going to work is, hotels will actually, we propose that they have to meet what's called the Living Building Challenge, which some of you are probably familiar with this program. It's a program that really looks comprehensively at the environmental impact of buildings, right? What are the emissions? What is the embodied carbon that goes into a building? What is the impact on the neighborhood and the community? But also, what are the equity impacts of development? And that makes this program unique, because usually when we show up at City Hall, advocating for better hotel construction, they say you can't talk about equity issues and also talk about land use issues. And we're saying those are connected, and the Living Building Challenge connects those issues. And so what we're proposing is that every future hotel in Seattle has to meet the Living Building Challenge in order to be able to proceed and move forward. That's a really ambitious and high standard and would change the game on the environmental impact of hotels. But we realize this standard is so ambitious that maybe nowadays, today, not everybody right off the bat is going to be able to meet that standard. And so we're also proposing that there's a second option, which is to basically negotiate agreements with the city on how those hotels are going to do the best they can to address climate impacts. And that's what we call climate incentive agreements. So the exciting part about this is that this is also going to open up space for workers, for construction workers, for example, who we are also working closely with on this, to actually advocate for their issues from an environmental viewpoint, right? And I think that is going to be so important as we go forward to bring our movements together, because we have an interest in pursuing, better buildings and better projects together and jointly. And that's just something that too often doesn't happen. And, you know, workers and the environmental movement get pitted against each other, even though there's always a solution that would benefit both. That's not how it plays out. And I think this is going to create a space where every time a hotel comes up, we're going to have to all get together and figure out what we do as a community. And I think that is really amazing and really exciting. So I'm going to wrap up here. We're just super excited to do this. I think it's going to be a game changer for how we as a community relate to an industry that is, you know, really unregulated and has taken advantage of people and communities and the planet. And we're really excited to change that together with you all.
Sweet. I really appreciate having you on this voice, because I think both of you, as you have said and Ruth has said, this is not usually a like very natural coalition of folks. Like, you don't usually see these folks talking on the same webinars together. And you're absolutely right, is that there's often a pitting of environmentalists versus workers. So it's really exciting to find where the collaborations make sense. Where are we in the agenda? So y'all have heard about the national significance of the campaign. If I haven't said this explicitly enough, I feel like it's worth actually saying really explicitly. Aside from New York, this is like the first time that anywhere in the country is actually really, especially on the West Coast, is taking a look at what we can do for existing buildings and tackling that question. We at SAFE have had some real successes when it comes to advocating for building electrification for new construction, which is great, but also not everybody lives in newer buildings. And we also have to eventually talk about the ones that already exist. So that's part of the significance. It's part of the piece of like having Seattle lead and provide a really strong template for the rest of us to be able to adopt. Then we talked about why electrification, the big broad context of how it's related to climate change and where we are now, as well as hearing about the ebbs and flows of this campaign and voices from labor. Now I want to hand it back over to Ruth, and maybe Neil can tag team on a conversation about how you can support, starting with a conversation about the Seattle mayor.
Okay. On this call, we are hoping you're all going to take action with us to call the Seattle mayor and tell him to pass this policy, or tell him to advance this policy at this point. And I'd love to share a bit more about why we're thinking that is going to be useful. So yeah, the Seattle mayor has signed on to some various climate commitments as part of his campaigning. He agreed to be a green mayor. He signed on to all these pledges. And he, like many mayors, he's very conscious of his image outside of Seattle. So I think what Seattle does really reflects on our mayor. So he, you know, if Seattle passes a nation-leading policy around transitioning off of gases in our buildings, the mayor's going to try and take credit for it. And if there's, which, you know, if we do it, we're happy to we're happy to give him some credit. And he doesn't want to get egg on his face and get embroiled in a controversy where climate groups, you know, big names like the Sierra Club and 350 are saying our mayor doesn't support climate action. So we think he's uniquely, unlike the Seattle City Council, he's uniquely positioned to actually move from pressure from outside of Seattle. And Neil reminded us earlier that we've seen him do this before, where 350 Seattle was working on a policy, again, like with labor, working to make community centers more climate resilient. And the mayor, kind of midway through the campaign, after it was really taking off, hopped on it and said, yes, this is great, let's do more. And so actually like made the policy stronger, got some great credit, got to look great. And yeah, so we're hoping he'll come through with that here as well. incidentally, he's also the boss of the Office of Sustainability and Environment, which is who is working on the policy. So that's another reason to call him. So Neil, anything to add to that, or are we ready to pass to Michelle?
I think that's it. Just for people who are trying to call the mayor and advocate for this policy, make sure to talk about strengthening the policy as opposed to just passing it, because I think he might find it easy to pass it in its current form, but we really don't want that. We need it to have some teeth before it gets passed.
Sweet. And to that end, the best way to do things is to do them together so we could all see at once. I believe you are still able to see the phone number as well as the little script that we've written up for y'all. How this is going to work, because we like, as much as possible, if we were in the same room together, we would all get on our phones and go to separate corners of the room and do the call at the same time, but we're in Zoom time, so we have to do it in a different way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call first and y'all can hear me do it. I'm going to read the out of towner script because I am not based in Seattle, and y'all can hear me do that as well. So here we go. 206-684-4000. All right. I'll put it close to the laptop so y'all can hear me do it. And after I'm done, then we'll all go off of mute. I'll give everybody about 5 minutes to be able to take it as well. That was a little nerve-wracking, doing a little public comment. I'm glad you're here with me.
Hi, thank you for calling. You have reached the office of Mayor Bruce Harrell. Please leave a brief message with your phone number and any other pertinent information, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you and have a great day.
Record your message at the tone. When you are finished, hang up or press pound for more options.
Hi, my name is Michelle Pignon, and I'm calling to urge you, Mayor Bruce Harrell, to pass the strongest, most climate-forward building performance standard. I'm actually based in Los Angeles, but I spent many years in Seattle, and I'm really hoping that Seattle, that has taught me so much in this movement, can pass a strong template that the rest of the country can follow. I'm also part of the Safe Cities Network, and I'm constantly having conversations with folks around the country who want to have a true leader to help figure out this challenge. Our demands are more ambitious timelines, reject false climate solutions like renewable natural gas, and remove the pay to pollute incentives. Thank you for hearing me out. My number is 562-445-6568. Thank you. That's how you do it, y'all. So with that, y'all saw me do it. Y'all, it's just a little nerve-wracking. Thank you for the applause. Let's all do a little go on mute, call the numbers. I'll leave the screen up and I will reconvene y'all in about 5 minutes and y'all can do your little celebrations. Let us know if you have any problems actually getting through. Also, I know there's some Canadians on here. Feel free to also call. We're all in the same world together. You feel to drop a little line in the chat when you're done. Let us know if there's any learnings. Fantastic. Looks like some folks even had, like, some people had fun. I actually had a little bit of fun. It was like almost being in the same room together. Thank you, thank you. Maybe we'll give it like another minute to make sure everybody got a chance. Oh my gosh, I love that. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate that. Thank you for, you know, in the Zoom world, we're constantly experimenting with new ways to kind of recreate the feeling of being in the same room together. So I ditto with the sentiment in the chat. It was actually kind of fun. I think I saw, ooh, Lisa left a message reminding him that the kids went to school together. I love that. Do a little personal touch in there. For folks are actually hungry for more. So maybe this is a good time for Neil in particular to tell us how people can be involved in more ways this upcoming weekend.
Thanks, Michelle. As Ruth said when they were explaining the overview of the campaign, what's been happening is Mayor Harrell has only been hearing from building owners so far. So we really need to change that. And one way to do that, or the way to start that, is with a high visibility action event to get it on people's radar and begin the process of education about this. So we're doing that this Earth Day. So Sierra Club and 350 Seattle are putting together a march and rally. It's going to start at City Hall at noon, and that's this Saturday. We're going to have some great speakers, and then we're going to walk for 1.5 miles. And on the way, we're going to point out a couple of the buildings that are some of the worst offenders. And in particular, we're going to stop by the Fairmont Hotel. As Stefan was saying, hotels are one of the most polluting building types, and the Fairmont happens to be one of the most polluting hotels. So that's a really good reason. But also, it's a completely non-union hotel. And it's really important with this campaign and with really all campaigns that we do everything we can to strengthen our connections with labor. Because building the clean energy future is going to take a lot of work. And so that it makes sense to partner with the people who will be benefiting from those jobs and make sure we're all working so to make sure that those are good family wage jobs. And so that's another reason for the Fairmont, is that they're not really good in terms of the way that they their relationship with their workers compared to some other hotels. So we're going to stop there for a bit and hear a little bit about that, hear from some labor leaders on it. And then we're going to continue on to the Amazon spheres. And that's where we're going to end the march. And then we're going to have a huge rally with lots of art and street theater. It's going to be really entertaining, big family-friendly event. And the reason for Amazon is somewhat symbolic. There are a number of big building owners who are part of a group that are opposing this. Amazon is part of that group. And we think their opposition is somewhat passive. They just happen to be part of that group. But they're not speaking out about it. They're not saying that they're in favor of this, which means they're on the side of opposition. So from Mayor Harrell's standpoint, they are one of the building owners that's saying, yeah, we'd rather not. And so Amazon is a really good example of a huge corporation that has enormous resources that's saying we don't want to pay this tiny amount to retrofit our buildings because it's inconvenient. And that, of course, differs from one building to the other. There are some where it is going to be more difficult, and that needs to be taken into account. But for the most part, we're talking about very large buildings. And the reason that the retrofitting started with these buildings is because these tend to be the building owners that have the resources. And actually, it turns out a lot of the buildings are owned by BlackRock, which is a big investor in fossil fuels. So these aren't mom and pop businesses that are struggling and trying to get by. These are the very largest buildings in Seattle, and they tend to be owned by investment firms as opposed to individuals who are running operations. The tenants are the ones who we're trying to protect. We're trying to make sure that those costs don't get passed on to the people who own the business, or own the businesses. So very, very much targeting just the owners of the buildings. So Amazon was chosen as a representative example of a very large corporation that owns a building that could easily do this, and really should be advocating for this policy. And then the other reason for Amazon is it turns out that if you look at the energy consumption of all buildings in Seattle and rank them, the very highest energy consumers are the data centers. There are 2 data centers within Seattle, and they use more energy per square foot than any other building anywhere. So these aren't owned by Amazon, but they're running Amazon services. Amazon actually gets paid. They provide the hardware that goes into the data centers. They get revenue for it, so it's effectively their operation. And so that's another reason to say, not only do you own a lot of large buildings, but you own these most polluting buildings in the entire city. And so for those reasons, Amazon was chosen as the endpoint for this march, to say this is an example of a building owner that really needs to get on the right page with this. And so we're going to hold that rally and see that they get that message. And if somebody can drop a link in the chat for that, you don't need to RSVP, but you could just show up at City Hall at noon. But somebody's going to drop in.
I think Ruth might have already done that. Oh, there goes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I love in the scheming that we've been doing together, being like, oh, it's a little bit like divide and conquer, like they like to do to us, but we're doing to them. Let's just like put Amazon in a corner, make them a friend for this. Thank you for that. So, and if you're looking for even more ways to stay involved, let me just like skip around slides here. As I mentioned earlier, this is a little bit of an experiment where we're co-hosting across a couple of different organizations. I wanted to personally invite any and all of you to join the Safe Organizing Network. Safe Cities is a project out of Stand.earth, and the intention really is to do this exact sort of thing. So if you, and I know for a fact there's folks in like other parts of Washington, other parts of the Northwest on this call, folks in Canada. If you want to continue to hear more stories of success, and if you're having a thing that you want like to troubleshoot with the rest of the folks and you're looking and yearning for that space, Safe Organizing is a real must be place. So we'll drop the link in the chat for that as well, stand.earth/safe organizing. And if you'd like to stay involved with some of the local efforts, you can also reach out to Ruth Sawyer directly, the real Ruth Sawyer, whose email is listed above here below. If for whatever reason you don't jot it down, it will also be in a follow-up email, but I would also recommend you do it right now so you don't forget. But without further ado, I did want to have a little bit of space for folks to do some Q&A questions. We did gather a few of them that I know are probably floating around. I'm curious, Logan, do you want to grab one that is catching your fancy and we can pose it to the group, and I can go ahead and spotlight all the speakers so they can respond?
Sure thing. So one of the questions that came through earlier was, do you find it challenging to explain such a policy-heavy campaign to the general public? Do folks intuitively understand the connection between buildings and climate, or do you have to educate people first?
Anybody can raise their hand. Well, any of the panelists. All right, Neil.
I think, yeah, it's probably not generally as well understood as it needs to be, that electrification is really the key to solving climate change. I mean, there's a lot to it, but 80% of stopping emissions is cleaning up the grid and electrifying everything that can be. So that is a message I think that really needs to get out more. But then in terms of building electrification, I think what one of the things that causes people a little bit of difficulty with this is that the technology we're talking about is brand new, the heat pump technology. And unfortunately, heat pumps have actually existed for a very long time, but haven't been very good. They didn't really work at low temperatures just because of the engineering challenges. And a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction is we're being asked to put in heat pumps. My experience or what I've heard is that they're not that good in low temperatures. And that is not at all true anymore. They've completely solved that. They go down to negative 20 degrees Celsius. In fact, in Norway, 1 in 4 people have a heat pump, and it's the most common new installation. So there's no question that they can be used in cold climates, but I think that's not well understood yet.
Awesome. Another question has come in on the chat, and this one's from Pat. And so Amazon tells people that they're really green. Are they? Why are they not supporting the standards?
So I can answer that too, because I've worked on a couple of other Amazon campaigns, and so multifaceted organization. So there's a lot to that question. I'm not going to say that they're not green at all, because they've done some things that are pretty good. The climate pledge does start to change their suppliers' behavior. But the problem is where most of Amazon's emissions come from, they're trying to just not talk about. And one of the main ones is shipping. So all of the goods that people are buying on Amazon get shipped across the world. Ships use the dirtiest fuel that exists. It's actually dirtier than the oil that most other transportation uses. And Amazon, we believe, really needs to be on the side of helping the shipping industry solve that. It's a difficult problem, but Amazon is not helping, and they have the resources to do so. So in that sense, I would say they're not very good. The data centers, we've got some reports that they're going to put in a new data center that's running off fracked gas. So it's actually the same gas for a lot of people who have been fighting refineries in the Northwest. It would be the same source. It would be the same fracked gas that we've been trying to prevent from coming into Washington. They would be building a data center in Oregon that uses that fracked gas, which is a horrible decision. And another reason that Amazon was chosen as a target in this campaign. So I would say Amazon has done a couple of things, but really their primary footprint, they are just trying to ignore. They're trying to walk away from the difficult problems and make a lot of noise about solving the easiest ones. And it's not that they're the worst. There are definitely worse companies. But Amazon, of the big tech companies, I would give them maybe a C-, which is a shame because they have the ability to do a lot of good and they're not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But Neil, if we're talking about the building standards, and Amazon has a lot of building space they either own or are using in downtown Seattle. Are their buildings green? Are they polluting?
They're fairly green because they're new buildings. So yeah, Amazon's buildings are not that bad. And that's another reason that we think it would be pretty easy for them to say we support this policy, because I mean their buildings don't need a lot of work. They're new buildings. They're highly efficient. So no, their climate footprint isn't from their buildings. It isn't from their direct operations. It's from the supply chain.
I feel like this is a really meaty question and also kind of gets to Amazon's just a huge corporation, and there are little parts and pieces of it that might be more progressive and more oriented. But at least where I'm at in Southern California, the big beef that folks have with them locally is just the giant warehouses. And those tend to also be in lower income neighborhoods. They're not the fancy buildings that you have in Seattle. I've seen those. Those are actually rather nice to be in. But it's such a big company that's hard to kind of unilaterally be like, this part is bad. But I would also, I don't know, Logan, do you want to talk about some of the other Amazon stuff, or is it secret still?
Oh, I don't know that it's secret, but I know we don't have very much time left. And there's one really great question that just came in the chat that I wanted to speak to make sure we don't lose it. And so this came from Rich. Does the building emissions performance standards go first to the mayor and then to the council, or directly to the council for a vote?
I can take this one. Yeah, so the building emissions performance standards goes to the council and then it goes to the mayor. The one twist of that is that right now the policy is in the Office of Sustainability Environment, which is, the mayor is the boss of that office. So the mayor is going to tell that office like, hey, I want this policy to come up for a vote. So there's kind of a circularity to this. But yeah, that's the current order.
Oh, and also a quick flag on time. We actually scheduled this one to go all the way until 7:30 Pacific time. So, but I mean, I also understand that was a lot of content, but we encourage you. We have a big open-ended space. We'll continue answering questions until about 7:30.
Sorry for that false urgency.
No, you're good. What else do we have?
Oh, actually, that's an important comment from Wendy, because we think it's going to end up in Strauss's committee. So that was a really important meeting that
It
Wendy,
was very
Yeah.
disappointing. He confirmed that he's on board totally, but then tried to press him on where it stood in terms of getting this to the council, and he was just, don't work with the council. You need, this is in the executive's office. It's got nothing to do with the council. And really you need to go to the state building code council. I mean, it was so disappointing. So I don't know if he knows something we don't know, or if he was just being a politician.
Can somebody from Seattle fill us in on for the out-of-towners on who's Strauss? Do we not?
Sorry, he's the council representative for my district, District 6, and is a city council member who is mostly on board with electrification.
And he chairs the land use committee, which is the committee that the both building policies would go to.
And he's also in the thick of a very controversial tree protection ordinance, which has been presented yet again to the city. And who drafted the ordinance, you might ask? The Seattle Department of Construction and Inspection, which has a slight conflict of interest. But it's, yeah, Strauss is not so well loved in that world either.
If the policy is going to the Committee on Sustainability and Rent Control, Swan's committee, and not the Land Use Committee. I got that from, I think, Peterson's staffer was saying that.
There's so much politicking. Fascinating. I have a question for the other folks that are on this call. I'm really curious. Recently, there was a lot of national conversations around gas stoves with the new publications that affirmed what we already knew. Many of us already knew about the emissions. I'm curious have y'all been having a lot of conversations with either politicians or activists around that? Does that feel like a natural entry point for this conversation about building electrification?
Well, we've worked with State Building Code Council, so now new commercial buildings no gas at all. New residential buildings, they can only use gas for stoves, not for heating or heating water. So
Yeah, and that's interesting strategically whether or not to go after gas stoves, because really the vast majority of emissions of gas consumption are from heating. It's like something like 80 or 90%. And so in a sense, it may make sense to just leave stoves off the table and say, we're just talking about heating, because for one thing, you're solving 90% of the problem, but also it's not likely that the gas industry would be able to economically justify connecting new pipelines for just gas stoves, given how little they use. So our strategy has really been to try to avoid that that controversial topic.
Ruth or Stefan? I have another question too that I have also been thinking about. Have you all considered or had conversations about expanding this work outside of Seattle? We know Seattle is a fairly progressively minded area. Any thoughts on what this campaign would look like if it was in more rural parts of Washington? I know that there's some folks, particularly Colleen from Yakima, so I'm just curious about y'all have had thoughts about that or conversations about that.
I can answer that a bit. I think this policy, we didn't get it down into the weeds, but it's quite complex. It has standards for like 30 different types of buildings, and so one of the things that makes it a little less accessible for lots of cities to do, kind of on different than like 100% clean energy resolution or a lot of other things, is that it's super in the weeds and complex about what buildings are doing what. So part of our thinking thus far has been that we're going to start by creating a model policy in Seattle, and we may choose different tactics at some point, but that's been our thinking. We'll create a model policy in Seattle, and then other cities around the country, around the state, can adopt it. And that's something that we've done in other situations, but also sometimes Seattle's not the best place to do these things, and other places have different politics and different alignments of power and ways of framing things, and so yeah, we'll see what happens, but
Sweet.
Yeah, I think that's part of sort of why it's exciting to cooperate and work together this way. I think when we do that, like sometimes stuff takes off, right? We started the $15 minimum wage in like the small airport city of SeaTac, right? And that then went to Seattle, and then it's sort of like now everybody talks about the $15 minimum wage, and I think what it took though was to be really bold and sort of organize together and put pressure on people. And I think it's gotten a little bit more difficult in Seattle to do that because our opponents are also more prepared for it. But I think that's why, like, sort of having unlikely allies together and really be ambitious and not let them water us down, like I think is what's important here, because that's then sends the signal in other places that this is a thing to do and a way to go.
Yeah. I'm also happy to end this space early. So here's what I propose. I have one question that I really want to ask this group of folks, and then I'll maybe wait see if there's another question, but otherwise we'll close the room maybe around 7:10, 7:15-ish, depending on where we're at. I am really curious, hearing from Stefan and Ruth and Neil, what has it been like having this partnership of labor and union with the environmental folks? Do you find that there's times where y'all really understand each other and there's times that you don't understand each other, just because it is such a novelty?
Who wants to go? I can just say that I think I think the environmental movement is not one monolith, right? And neither is the labor movement, right? And I think we are oftentimes good at sort of within the labor movement, for example, to find ways to work together despite our differences, right? Folks who work in the construction trades or, the fire department, like, are very different from the folks who work in hotels or the janitors, right? And, when it comes to, where immigration status or, like different ethnic communities, right? Like, obviously, there's big differences and we don't like always speak the same language. But we also all are like impacted, right? And like, especially when we talk about our membership, folks who have to, they don't have public transportation options. Their shift starts at 5 in the morning. So they have to take the car from like a far out suburb in Seattle. They can't afford the parking. They have to work 2 jobs. They have to sit in traffic at the worst times. That's, they would be so much better off, right, if we had a good public transportation system, if they could live closer in, if they were actually emitting less greenhouse gases in their daily lives than they currently do, but they have no other choice. And so I think like there's actually a natural connection, and we just have to do a lot of talking and a lot of like education internally. And then we also have to figure out sometimes, and sometimes the environmental movement doesn't understand the struggles of folks in the labor movement and like of low-wage workers, for example. And sometimes we end up in situations where we have to figure something out that has real impacts on us, and folks just roll over us. And I think like what's exciting about like knowing each other and talking to each other and is that it becomes much more natural to actually go to each other and say like, hey, we're doing this. What do you think, right? And how can we actually avoid this problem? And we just come up with better solutions from the beginning. And I think that's really exciting. And especially 350's commitment to doing this work over the last few years, I think is starting to make a big difference. And we can, I can go to the construction trades and say, we're thinking about an environmental policy, and they're not, kicking me out of the room. They're saying, oh, like, what are you thinking, right? And because they understand power, and part of what we're trying to do is shift the power. Right? So I don't know, I'm super excited about it, and it connects 2 things that I deeply care about, and really most of us deeply care about.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and especially what you were saying, Stefan, about the environment movement hasn't always understood labor's concerns. So personally, I think the relationships that we're building are one of the best things to come out of this policy, because you're right, the environmental movement has often talked about labor in that building all of these projects is going to put a lot of people to work, therefore labor should be supportive. But we hadn't done a great job of actually talking with people in labor. And so I'm really excited to see that starting to happen, where we're not just talking about the benefits, but we're learning about the concerns. We're learning about what would it take to work together on this. And so now with this campaign, it's the first time I'm really seeing a lot of progress towards us working directly together, hearing from one another, understanding, okay, what kind of vision do we both share for the world? Because it turns out there's quite a lot of overlap.
And the Labor Council endorsed the building performance standards policy, right? And last night they also endorsed our hotel policy. They did it unanimously, right? Which means that, you know, every construction trade in the room voted yes on this, or at least didn't vote no, but they probably voted yes. And that's just like a testament of the work that has been happening over the last few years, that is now possible.
I really appreciate y'all taking some time to answer that question, because I think for me, that's one of the big learnings that I've had about, you know, when we're looking at who's in the room, who do we need to talk to, where do we need to build power, it's easy to overlook that subset of folks because they're not within our periphery, but that there's some real natural and strong alliances. I'm not seeing any other questions, and I would love to release y'all early so we could get started on the weekend almost. What is Friday? Thank y'all so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing. And also thank you, the audience, for like having great questions and good insights too. I really appreciate the space. Y'all will see a reminder email from perhaps me and Ruth. And thank you once again for being in this space. Have a good night, y'all.